The camera didn't move. The student did, and in that single forgotten frame, no more than half a second, an entire life collapsed. If you blinked, you missed it. If you looked closer, you saw everything they tried to bury, and they said she vanished on a Tuesday. That's how these stories always begin, clean, ordinary, almost polite. A missing college student, early 20s, good grades, no known enemies, a routine walk across campus that never finished. The kind of case that fills local news for a week, then quietly rots in a filing cabinet. But this one didn't rot. It waited, and her name doesn't matter at first. What matters is the silence that followed her disappearance. Friends claimed they last saw her near the library just before dusk. Security said the cameras showed nothing unusual. Police called it voluntary absence. The university issued a statement full of careful language and empty concern, and the family was left staring at a bedroom that still smelled like her shampoo, wondering how a human being could evaporate in a place designed to watch everyone. And America likes to believe its campuses are safe islands, controlled environments with bright lights and emergency phones every 50 feet. We tell our children that danger lives somewhere else. But danger doesn't need darkness. It only needs permission, and for weeks the search went nowhere. Posters peeled off brick walls. Candlelight vigils burned down to wax stains on concrete. Tips came in, then dried up. Detectives followed the usual trails, boyfriends, classmates, online messages, but every path collapsed into nothing. She had no history of running away, no signs of depression, no packed bags, just a normal day that ended without warning. And then there was the camera, and not the one everyone looked at, not the wide-angle feed overlooking the quad, not the entrance camera with the blinking red light meant to reassure parents. This was a secondary camera, installed years earlier after an unrelated incident. A camera with a narrow field of view. A camera no one thought mattered, and it sat above a maintenance corridor, angled just slightly wrong, too low, too tight, too easy to ignore. For months, the footage sat untouched. Thousands of hours of students passing through like ghosts, reduced to timestamps and shadows, until one analyst, exhausted and angry, decided to rewind further than protocol allowed. And what appeared wasn't dramatic. No struggle, no scream, just a shift in perspective, a change in angle that revealed something the others couldn't. A moment where a person thought they were unseen. And that's the lie these places are built on, the belief that someone, somewhere, isn't watching, and the footage showed her entering the frame, alive, distracted, human. And then, just behind her, a movement that didn't belong, a presence that had learned how to hide in plain sight, the kind that understands routines, blind spots, and trust. And this is where the story stops being about a missing student and starts becoming something older, something buried deep in the American system of quiet corridors and institutional silence. Because once you see what that camera caught, once you understand why that angle mattered, you can never look at safety the same way again. And the archive didn't want this opened. But it was, and what it revealed wasn't just how she disappeared, and it revealed why. And when investigators replayed the footage frame by frame, they weren't looking for a monster. They were looking for an accident, something simple enough to explain away. That's how the mind protects itself, by assuming the worst thing must also be the most ordinary. But the camera refused to cooperate, and at first glance it looked empty. Just a concrete hallway, fluorescent lights buzzing like insects trapped in glass. Then she entered the frame, walking with the distracted confidence of someone who believed she was safe. Her phone was in her hand. Her backpack hung loosely from one shoulder. Nothing about her posture suggested fear. Nothing suggested she knew she was already being studied. And 3 seconds later, a shadow crossed the wall behind her, and not a person. Not yet, just a distortion in light, thin and almost apologetic, like it didn't want to be noticed. The analyst paused the footage, rewound it, played it again. That's when they saw what everyone else had missed for months. The camera didn't lie, it just didn't speak loudly. And the angle mattered because it caught what the others couldn't, the space between movements. The gap where intention lives. As she passed beneath the light, someone else adjusted their pace to match hers, close enough to follow, far enough to deny it later. A figure that blended into the architecture, wearing the same neutral colors every authority figure on campus wore, the kind of clothing that made people invisible by design. And this wasn't chance, it was choreography. And the person stayed just outside the center of the frame, using the camera's limitations like a shield. But when the hallway narrowed, the geometry betrayed them. For a fraction of a second, their face became visible. Not clear, not dramatic, just enough to prove existence, and that single frame broke the case open. And because once you acknowledge that someone was there, the entire narrative collapses. Voluntary disappearance becomes impossible. Accident becomes unlikely, and coincidence starts to feel like an insult. And the university had access to this footage the entire time. So did campus security, so did local law enforcement. And yet no one saw it. Or worse, they saw it and chose not to understand what it meant. Institutions don't like answers that implicate themselves. They prefer ambiguity. Ambiguity doesn't demand accountability. And as the investigation reopened, names began to surface. Maintenance staff, contract workers, people who knew the back corridors better than the students did. People who moved freely through locked spaces without raising suspicion. Background checks were reviewed, then quietly ignored. Complaints filed years earlier were unearthed. Stamped resolved without explanation, and patterns began to form. Not just in this case, but in others. Near misses, uncomfortable encounters brushed aside as misunderstandings, students who changed routes without knowing why, fear that couldn't be articulated because it had never been officially acknowledged. And the camera angle didn't just show who followed her. It showed how the system allowed it. And when detectives finally identified the figure, they realized something far more disturbing than a single crime. They realized this person had been recorded dozens of times before, always hovering at the edge of the frame, always present. Always forgotten, and history doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers from neglected hard drives and mislabeled files. Sometimes it waits for someone tired enough, angry enough, or brave enough to look where they were told not to. And then once you do, you start to see the truth not as a shock, but as a pattern. And the moment a pattern emerges, the past begins to rearrange itself. Events that once felt isolated start leaning toward each other, like fragments of a larger confession trying to be heard. That's what happened when investigators widened their scope beyond the single hallway. The camera angle had cracked the door. Now everything behind it demanded to be seen, and they pulled footage from other buildings. Different nights, different semesters, the same narrow margins, always the edge of the frame, always someone moving with intention but without urgency. It was a presence that understood how attention worked and how to avoid it, not by running, but by belonging. And what unsettled the analysts most wasn't the behavior, it was the consistency. The figure appeared during shift changes, during moments of institutional fatigue, late evenings, early mornings, times when oversight thinned, times when students believed the danger had gone home for the night. And in one clip, a student paused as if sensing something wrong. She looked over her shoulder, hesitated, then continued walking. The figure slowed too. In another, the same silhouette stood motionless for nearly a minute, letting a group of students pass, then resumed following a lone person once the hallway emptied. This wasn't impulse. It was patience, and when the name finally surfaced, it didn't arrive with drama, it arrived in a spreadsheet. A maintenance contractor who had worked on campus intermittently for years. No criminal record that mattered, no active warrants, just enough complaints to suggest a pattern, not enough to force action. The kind of file that exists in the gray space institutions rely on to protect themselves, and former students were contacted. Some declined to speak. Others spoke quietly, reluctantly, as if naming the past might summon it back. They described the same feeling, a sense of being watched, of footsteps matching their own, of someone who always seemed to appear where they shouldn't. They had reported it, or thought about reporting it, or decided it wasn't worth the trouble. And that's how silence compounds. Not through fear alone, but through inconvenience. And the night she disappeared, the timeline aligned too well to ignore. Her phone data showed a brief loss of signal in the corridor where the camera was mounted. A dead zone the university had known about for years. A place where emergency calls dropped, a place where help didn't travel well, and the footage ended before anything explicit occurred. No violence, no struggle, just her exiting the frame and never appearing on any other camera again. It was as if the building itself had swallowed her. But buildings don't act alone. They only provide cover, and search dogs lost her scent near a service elevator, one that required keycard access, access the suspect had, access that was never logged correctly because the system was outdated. Budget constraints, they said, technical limitations, reasonable explanations that become weapons when stacked together, and the deeper investigators went, the more resistance they met. Requests delayed, records missing, interviews postponed. The case had stopped being about finding her. It had become about protecting a reputation built on safety brochures and donor confidence. But history doesn't care about branding, and the camera angle had already done its damage. It had revealed not just a follower, but a framework. A system where harm could repeat itself quietly, efficiently, and without consequence until someone vanished. And then once a person vanishes, the ground beneath the institution starts to shift. Cracks appear, stories leak out, and the archive begins to speak in a language no press release can silence. And as the case reopened, something subtle but irreversible happened. The campus changed, not in appearance but in memory. People began to remember things they had trained themselves to forget. A look held too long, a hallway that suddenly felt wrong, a shortcut avoided without knowing why. Fear has a way of rewriting the past once it's given permission, and investigators started reconstructing her final day hour by hour. Classes attended, messages sent. Small decisions that felt meaningless at the time. She had left the library just after sunset, choosing the maintenance corridor because it shaved 4 minutes off the walk back to her dorm. 4 minutes. That was the difference between being seen and being alone, and friends remembered her mentioning someone who made her uncomfortable weeks earlier. A man who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. She had laughed it off. So had they. On American campuses, danger is often reframed as awkwardness. It's easier that way. Less paperwork, less fear, and when detectives interviewed the suspect, the conversation stayed calm, too calm. He denied everything without emotion, claimed he barely remembered her, said he walked those halls every day, said coincidence was being mistaken for intent, and on paper it almost worked. No direct evidence. No witnesses, no blood, just a camera angle and a series of decisions that pointed in one direction. But then came the mistake, and during a routine follow-up, an investigator asked about a hallway he shouldn't have known about, a corridor not listed on public maps, a place only staff accessed. The suspect corrected him, casually, instinctively. He described the lighting, the echo, the way sound traveled there at night, and that correction was the crack, and digital forensics followed. Deleted files, storage drives swapped months earlier without authorization. A personal laptop turned in late. On it, fragments, nothing explicit, nothing illegal by itself. But together they formed a picture of fixation, campus maps, shift schedules, screenshots of social media posts taken seconds after they were uploaded, proof of proximity masquerading as coincidence, and the most unsettling discovery came last. A folder labeled with a date, her date. Inside it, a still frame pulled from the same camera that solved the case. The same angle, the same hallway, the same moment, cropped tighter, enhanced, studied. And he had seen the footage, and which meant the truth had been known long before it was acknowledged. It had lived in private, while the family pleaded publicly, while posters faded, while the institution waited for time to erase what silence couldn't, and when the arrest was finally made, there was no spectacle, no press conference worth remembering, just a line in the local paper, charges filed, an investigation ongoing, the language careful, legal, bloodless. But beneath it was a truth too heavy to print, and she wasn't taken because no one was watching. And she was taken because the wrong person was. And the camera angle didn't just solve the case. It exposed a vulnerability built into places we teach our children to trust. It showed how safety fails not all at once, but gradually through ignored warnings, outdated systems, and the belief that nothing bad has happened yet, so nothing bad will. And history will record this as a solved case. A name, a sentence, an ending. But endings are a luxury the past doesn't always deserve. Because even after the footage was seen, even after the truth surfaced, one question refused to disappear. And how many times had that camera watched someone else walk alone? And how many times had no one bothered to look? And there is a moment in every buried story where the truth stops being about the victim and starts becoming about us. This was that moment. Because once the arrest was made, once the footage was acknowledged, something far more uncomfortable surfaced, how easily all of it could have been stopped. And the family was finally shown the video. Not the enhanced version, not the cropped stills, just the raw footage. A daughter walking into a hallway that should have been safe. A shadow following at a distance that felt intentional only after you knew how the story ended. They didn't need explanations. They didn't ask for theories. They recognized the weight of that silence instantly. Parents always do. And what broke them wasn't what the camera showed. It was what it didn't. There was no moment to intervene. No dramatic struggle. No chance for help to arrive late. Just a clean disappearance inside a system that insisted it was designed to prevent exactly that. And as the trial approached, the university shifted strategies. Legal teams spoke carefully. Policies were updated. Cameras were replaced. Emergency lighting improved. All the changes that arrive only after someone is gone. None of them mentioned her name, and former students began reaching out to journalists anonymously. Stories poured in, too similar to ignore. Encounters with the same man, the same uneasy feeling. The same decision to stay quiet. Some had been warned by friends, some had complained. All had been forgotten, not erased, archived. And that's how institutions survive scandal. They don't destroy evidence, they bury it under time. And the defense argued there was no definitive moment of violence on camera, no proof beyond circumstance. But circumstance, when repeated, and structure, when ignored, becomes permission. And what the jury saw wasn't just a crime. It was a system of blind spots stacked on top of each other. A narrow camera angle, a dead signal zone, an outdated access log, a man who understood all of it better than anyone because he worked inside it. He didn't break the system, he used it exactly as it was. And when the verdict came back, it felt quieter than it should have. No cheers, no relief, just exhaustion. Closure is a word people use when they don't know how to describe permanent absence. And if you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? And because that's the question this case leaves behind, not how it happened, but why it was allowed to. And some viewers will call this an anomaly, a rare failure. But history doesn't work that way. It repeats itself in places that believe they're immune: campuses, hospitals, churches. Anywhere trust replaces vigilance, and the camera angle solved the case, yes. But it also revealed something darker, that the truth was always there, waiting patiently in a corner no one thought to check. And that the difference between safety and tragedy is often nothing more than whether someone chooses to look. And the archive doesn't scream about that. It whispers. And once you hear it, you start noticing how many other places sound the same. And even after the verdict, the campus never really returned to normal. People still walked the same paths, attended the same classes, laughed in the same courtyards, but something underneath had shifted. An unspoken awareness settled in. The kind you feel but never name, like standing on ground you now know can open beneath you without warning. And the hallway where the camera hung was renovated within months. Fresh paint, brighter lights, new signage. Students passing through today have no idea why it looks newer than the rest of the building. They don't know that for years that corridor was a blind spot disguised as a shortcut. History has a way of being remodeled until it's unrecognizable, but the footage still exists, and it lives on backup drives, in evidence lockers, in training seminars where it's dissected clinically, stripped of emotion and reduced to lessons learned. Professionals pause the frame, draw boxes, talk about angles and coverage. They never talk about the feeling of watching someone alive for the last time without knowing it, and that feeling belongs to the family now, and they moved away. Not because they wanted distance, but because the geography itself had become hostile. Every brick reminded them of a system that failed with confidence. They don't give interviews anymore. Not because they've healed, but because repeating the story doesn't bring her back. It only brings the hallway closer, and what lingers most isn't rage. It's the quiet realization that the signs were always there, not just in this case, but in so many others that never reached a courtroom. Missing people whose stories ended before the right camera angle was found. Families who never got a frame to point to and say, "Dear, that's where everything changed." And we like to believe technology will save us. That cameras mean accountability. That footage equals truth. But cameras don't care. They don't warn. They don't intervene. They only record, and even then, only what they're allowed to see. And the most unsettling part of this case isn't the man who followed her. It's how easily he adapted to the architecture of trust. He didn't need forced. He needed familiarity. He needed routine. He needed everyone else to believe the system worked well enough not to question it. And that belief is everywhere, and in every place that says, "This doesn't happen here." In every institution that mistakes reputation for safety. In every archive where uncomfortable evidence waits patiently for someone to feel curious or guilty enough to look again. And the camera angle became famous in training manuals, in podcasts, in whispered conversations about the case that changed everything. But change is a generous word. What really happened is that one truth escaped containment, and once it did, it exposed how many others are still sealed away. And somewhere right now, footage is being recorded that won't be reviewed until it's too late. Somewhere, a blind spot is being passed through without thought. Somewhere, someone believes they are unseen, and someone else believes they are safe. And history isn't finished with this story. It never is. It just closes the file and waits for the next angle, the next analyst, the next moment when silence finally becomes too loud to ignore. And because the past doesn't disappear, and it watches, and long after the case faded from headlines, long after the campus brochures were reprinted and the lawsuits quietly settled, the footage remained unchanged, grainy, ordinary, terrifying only if you understood what you were looking at. That's the nature of real horror. It doesn't announce itself, it waits to be interpreted, and historians often say the past is fixed, that what happened is sealed, untouchable. But this is a lie we tell ourselves to sleep at night. The past is not fixed. It's active. It breathes through records, through habits, through the systems we inherit without questioning. And sometimes it reaches forward and takes someone. And this case will be remembered as a technical breakthrough, a reminder to check secondary cameras, to audit blind spots, to upgrade access logs. That's how institutions digest tragedy, by turning it into procedure. But procedure doesn't carry grief, it doesn't carry fear. It doesn't carry the weight of knowing that a single human life can be reduced to a timestamp and a camera angle. And what the archive really holds is an evidence. It's warning, and a warning that safety is often an illusion maintained by repetition. A warning that evil doesn't need darkness, it needs familiarity. A warning that the most dangerous figures are rarely the ones who look out of place. They are the ones who belong, and somewhere in America, a parent is watching this video and realizing they once trusted a map, a badge, a lighted path. Somewhere, a student is reconsidering a shortcut they've taken 100 times. Somewhere, an administrator is hoping no one ever looks too closely at their own forgotten footage. And that's how these stories live on, not as isolated nightmares, but as quiet pressure beneath everyday life. You feel it when you walk alone at night, when you sense eyes without seeing a face, when you realize the system around you is built by people, and people leave gaps. And the camera angle didn't just solve a case, it reminded us of something older than technology, older than campuses, older than law. That truth is fragile, that vigilance decays, and that history doesn't protect the innocent, it only records what happened when protection failed. And you were never supposed to find this archive. You were never supposed to sit with this knowledge. But now that you have, it stays with you, in the back of your mind, in the corners you glance at twice, in the understanding that the past is closer than it appears. And because somewhere right now, a camera is recording something no one will review for months, or years, or ever, and then the past is watching to see if this time someone will look before it's too late.